There is so much wrong in our world. There's wrong with the world, there's wrong with other people, there's wrong with the government, and there's wrong with the country. And we might even know a whole bunch of ways it could be right. But mostly, the one thing that's never quite wrong is ourselves. We live in a world not unlike the worlds that human beings have always lived in, where we have a lot of difficulty in blaming ourselves. And certainly it seems that there's more to blame than ever. I mean, in the world of coronavirus and lockdown and money being lost and stolen and the unequalness of vaccine programs and all of that, there seems more opportunity to blame others than there's ever been. And in fact, when we look at the virus, we can see that in the initial stages especially, one of the most strong focuses of anyone's efforts was to find out who was at fault. Trump famously called it the China virus, blaming it on China because it was identified there, or because perhaps it arose there. But of course, the blame in that situation was for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which were political. And that kind of shifting around of blame is something that we all do all the time for all sorts of reasons. So what I thought I'd do tonight is look more closely at those personal reasons for shifting blame around and finding fault in everyone perhaps except ourselves, or sometimes the other way around and blaming ourselves for everything. But blame, as long as there's blame, there are questions of responsibility, and there's not only of who's responsible for causing the thing that you want to blame them for, but who's responsible for fixing it. And because we would want to fix it, I think we do need to revise our understanding of blame. Why do we blame others, be they people or organizations or countries or fate or whatever it may be? And how can we take responsibility back? How can we shift things back to ourselves? How can we even shift the blame back to ourselves without too much pain? Of course, at its heart, blame is entirely self-serving. It's all about I'm right and you're wrong for most of us. And essentially, most of us take credit for what's good in our lives and what works out in our lives, but blame others when things don't. And although I'm describing that at the personal scale, that is what you can see in the global behavior. I'm going to keep on referring to the pandemic as just the most current example, but it is a great example because even when you go beyond the politics, it's, so if people blame China, then they also are likely to have a certain political attitude. And so to them it's extremely factual that China is responsible for the pandemic. But then you get people who might be very different in their politics. So they can't blame China because politically they don't come from that same point of view. They're just going to blame someone else. And with the pandemic you see a great example of that because you have conspiracy theories, you have particular individuals who are supposedly responsible. The spectrum of it's anyone except me that's demonstrated by every possible cause of who's to blame for coronavirus is really just a great example in how people don't take responsibility for anything. And although certainly individuals, people are not responsible for the actual virus itself, what we do know and understand, it's our destruction of the environment and destruction of animal life and our pushing into natural environments, our destruction of the climate. All of these are the factors that, as we know, have made us extremely vulnerable to viruses that cross species and other reasons why they can get us. And that means we are to blame. that we are individually to blame, not just for, say, causing the virus, which is easy to say, well, I didn't cause that. But certainly it becomes about responsibility for our own individual lifestyles. It's really just an example. I'm not trying to say, point finger, you're to blame, you're to blame, you're to blame, I'm to blame. Some people are sitting there thinking, I'm the perfect vegan, I never use resources unwisely, I treat the environment very well, I live in a forest, I do all of those things, it can't be me. And while maybe that is true, let's just keep on track here. The point is that we will constantly find ways where it's not me. Now, the virus is only an imperfect example that I'm giving, but essentially we avoid ways of being responsible, especially for things that make us vulnerable. So we don't want to be vulnerable because that arises out of admission that we're doing something wrong or we've done something wrong. We are less than others, less than something when that happens to us. And we don't feel in control. We feel in control when we know that something else or someone else is responsible for whatever the problem might be. And so the denial of responsibility and the blaming of others makes us not feel the responsibility, the pain, and does make us feel superior to whoever is at fault, because kind of they're wrong and I'm right. So at its heart, blame is a defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms mostly protect us from destructive emotions. But defense mechanisms can be too much of a good thing. Just like the immune system can sometimes go too far, and even many allergies arise out of an overactive immune system that has such a strong need to protect us that it even protects us from things that are not harmful. Defense mechanisms can work that way. Sometimes emotions can be very harmful and destructive to our lives, and so that's why we have those defense mechanisms. But sometimes it protects us from feeling emotions that perhaps we need to feel, the ones that come along with taking responsibility for something. Because in the end, taking responsibility for something will give us more power than not being responsible for it. In the simplest sense, if we are responsible, we can change it. We can do something about it. As long as we are not responsible for something, we have no power over it. It's one of the core philosophies in Stoicism, and I've even spoken about blame related to Stoicism a few years back. But the one of the core philosophies there is you should only be concerned with that which you are in control of. Because what is the point of being concerned about things you have absolutely no power to change or influence, which is 90% or more of the world around you? So blame figures into that as well, because blame makes us not only take responsibility for what we are responsible for, but it points us to the difficult stuff and the problematical stuff, or the stuff that is creating issues for oneself or others. So we need to remember, blame is about taking responsibility, which is about taking control back over what we are in control of. So avoidance of blame, shifting of blame, which can come from denying blame, or projecting it, blaming it on someone else, or turning it into something else. So sometimes in order to avoid owning our own emotions, we can express them as different emotions or experience them as different emotions or different things that takes us away from that. Sometimes even into pain. We can even experience physical pain or physical illness as a kind of displaced emotion, which allows us to deal with the illness and so on without having to own some kind of weakness or vulnerability by being responsible for whatever the problem is. Essentially, blaming ourselves, taking the blame, can lower our sense of self-esteem because I've done something wrong or bad. And so the defenses protect us from that. Defense mechanism protects us from accepting that we're flawed or that we have failed. And that's when it's gone too far, because, well, we are flawed. And we sometimes will naturally fail. But failure to accept our own flaws is an overactive defense system and can get us into projecting blame onto others. It can go much further, kind of harder, more active than that. Blame can actually be a method of attack, which might be part of what was happening, of course, in the political blames of who's responsible for the virus. So, as a way of not dealing with our own stuff, it often is much easier just to turn our stuff into an attack. And literally trying to hurt someone as a way of not accepting that we are hurt is another way of kind of defending ourselves from that pain. It's a very destructive way, but it's finding flaw and finding a reason for someone else to feel more pain than yourself. Similarly, find a reason for someone else to be more at blame, more wrong than you are. Wouldn't we like to believe that Donald Trump's continuous blaming of the virus on China was in some unexpected way an acknowledgement, an unconscious acknowledgement of his own flaws by projecting it onto China, blaming them for something bigger than anything he might have been responsible for. All the attacks that he was receiving politically, he turns into an attack onto another country, which is not at all unusual behavior in politics. It's not only Trump, they've all done that, and it's part of how we try and take the moral high ground, is by blaming someone else. I mean, the truth really is, we're not really good at understanding why people do things. We're not very good at figuring out the cause of someone else's behavior. And very often we attribute things to ourselves which are not really the result of our own talents or skills. For example, something that happened out of sheer luck to ourselves, we will attribute to our own skill. Something that happened out of sheer bad luck to somebody else, we will blame on them. Similarly to ourselves, when good things happen, we take credit for it. When bad things happen, we look for someone or something to blame. So we're very bad at judging who is actually responsible for what, and why do people do the things we do? Because we're so wrapped up in ourselves and our own reasons for choosing to be responsible for some things, the good stuff, and not being responsible for other things, is that it makes us realize our self-esteem is an enormous vulnerability. We desperately need to feel good and strong, but the way that we go about it is by shifting blame, by disowning all the negative stuff and owning all the positive stuff. When you put it that way, you can hear how flawed that strategy is going to be. It might work in some kind of an ideal world, but to an outsider, it's obvious that you cannot be responsible for all the good stuff in your life and not responsible for all the bad stuff in your life. It just wouldn't make sense. Similarly, that it doesn't make sense that the good stuff is luck, but the bad stuff is responsibility. Or similarly, it doesn't make sense that we can say the good things that happen are my own skill, the bad things that happen are my own bad luck. Never good luck for good things. Never bad skills for bad things. It's just our human nature. There's way less effort in being responsible and recognizing our own responsibility. And at some level, we don't even want to make any effort. And that can be a simple reason why we don't even want to go there. It's too much if I get involved in, I'm responsible, and then there's the hows and the whys and the what am I going to do about it. It's just easier to blame someone else. Let's not forget that one of the most basic reasons why people blame others is the same reason why children often blame others, and that is everybody lies. It's just easier to lie so often. We don't like to think that. And in fact, people like to think that children are alarmingly honest, which isn't really true. Children have a greater capacity to lie than adults do, because they have less of a sense of responsibility. when adults do have a sense of responsibility. So sometimes it's like, no one will really know. If I just blame someone else or put the blame on someone else, especially if it's an unknown stranger, like who broke something, it starts with childhood when we say it wasn't me. In the case of blaming someone else, it's our relationships that stand to benefit. When we learn to accept our own role in a bad situation, we can dramatically improve the communication and the interaction and the outcome in trying to resolve issues that arise in relationships. Because obviously the biggest danger zone in dealing with blame is in a personal relationship where we blame the partner for something. In arguments between people in a relationship, it's mostly the other person's fault. And while there is a whole psychology of arguments and fights going on in there, what is important is we presumably want the relationship to improve and grow. So learning to take responsibility for things can change your relationship with all others, but especially in terms of your relationship, you will achieve a greater level of fulfillment and ultimately of maturity in the relationship when each person knows what they are responsible for, including the good stuff and the growing stuff that they're responsible for. Sometimes, in the simplest sense, owning responsibility in a relationship or in any situation completely disempowers the danger of blame. Because blame can cause victimization, can cause, in the end, can cause great danger to whoever is blamed, because it can become scapegoating. Scapegoating is probably the most dangerous form of blame, because it can let people, their lives or their circumstances can become destroyed because of scapegoating. In terms of relationships, owning blame and saying, I know, I did that, often completely disempowers the other. And they can no longer point fingers, they can no longer expose you. They no longer have power over you because they can expose that you're responsible for something. If you expose it yourself, if you just say, I know, I did that. It was Socrates who said, most people are probably not willingly doing something wrong. Most people don't even think they are doing something wrong when they're doing something wrong. They think they're right, but they're just mistaken. And he says, if you consider whether anything that you blame something else for was actually intentional or not on their part, it might strongly change how you deal with it. Always consider, was it intentional? Even if it was foolish and callous, was it intentional? And if it wasn't an intentional behavior, is it correct to actually blame them for it? What they did was something that led to a harmful outcome, but that wasn't what they were actually doing. So we can say, rather than blame them, we can accept that they probably were trying to do better or do something good. There isn't responsibility for what bad happened. I can reframe this. And reframing things that we blame others for as learning experiences or whatever you might choose is often a way to kind of shift things back to yourself without the harm of what do I do with the responsibility for that. Frame it in something that you can do something about. Obviously, there are wrongs, there are moral wrongs. So we must actually have a good moral or ethical basis for looking at the world. And there is such a thing as doing something wrong. There is such a thing as someone else being responsible for. I'm not suggesting that we sweep away all responsibility of others. That's not where we're going with this. But it is stopping to think, did they actually mean to do that? And even if they are responsible, although they didn't mean to do it, blame becomes a negative and destructive behavior, destructive to them and to yourself. The side effect would be greater tolerance for others, greater understanding for others, greater compassion and empathy for others. If you learned to see the actions of other people as generally an effort or attempt to do the right thing, even if you don't agree with it, even if they didn't end up as doing the right thing, we'll tend to become much more tolerant. And then there's blaming fate. And we say, you know, it's like fate had it out for me, or fate hurt me in some kind of a way. And we forget, as the Stoics say, you're not the only person in the picture. Your bad might have been someone else's good. How often does a disaster turn out to be something that's a blessing in disguise? Or how often does something that's amazing turn out to be a difficult lesson? We forget, we're not the only person that matters. One person's loss is another person's gain. So if fate is to blame, if fate exists, and the thing that was fated was fate's fault, is it all there for you? If you're the one who suffered but someone else benefited, then surely fate isn't just there for you. So blaming fate is not a constructive behavior. Blaming fate is just another way to shift responsibility, even if fate does exist. Because even if fate does exist, it wasn't just about you. So it's not correct to blame anything. All we can do is bring responsibility back to ourselves. And how do we take it back? How do we bring the story back to ourselves? Well, firstly, we can stop going on about it so much. We tend to harp on about the things that we blame others for. It becomes a convenient hook to hang everything on, and we've got to learn to not just repeat old stories, and they create a reality of their own. Each time we tell a story about another person, we reinforce it, we recreate it, we make extra reasoning. Those kind of stories, we would have to admit, become increasingly worse for the person who's blamed. So we need to wind down those stories, stop recounting stories, and work more on our self-esteem. We should not allow our self-esteem to be vulnerable to all these blames of other people. We don't need to tell that story, we don't need to keep blaming them, and we need to bring things back to compassion and empathy and understanding, as Socrates said, that they didn't really mean to do that most of the time. We basically need to empathize. We need to think about, why did they do that? What was their perspective on the story? Why did they come from there? What is their point of view, rather than just completely blaming? Very often, best thing to do when we blame someone is to ask ourselves the question, and why did they do that? Were they really evil? Were they out to get me? If we're honest, that's hardly ever a reason why someone does something. So we can bring it all down, even when it's not our fault, even when it is their fault. If we understand intention correctly, we get rid of blame and rather ask the question, what can I do about it? Those Stoics were clear in that basic truth. We are in control of what we do and how we react. Blame puts us at the mercy of someone else. So even if it's not clear who's responsible, owning responsibility is a way to take control of the situation, of how you feel about it, of how you react to it, and of what you can do about it. Blaming yourself is empowering yourself, because blaming yourself is being responsible. Whether fate or other people are involved, even if they are involved, bringing it back to yourself is bringing the power and the locus of change back to yourself. And that's the value of it. That's the only thing you would want to get out of it. That's the thing that will ultimately raise that self-esteem. We spend way too much time worrying about what other people do and what other people think. We should watch ourselves, says Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher. He says, train yourself to answer to thoughts only about yourself, not others. Catch yourself thinking about other people and worrying about why they do something, or what they might do, or what they did say, or what they might say. Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic philosopher, says, you've got no time to worry about others. Leave their faults where they started. And remember, he says, that you are mortal. You can't waste your limited time worrying about what other people do. All of us trip and fail. All of us trip and fall. All of us trip and fall, he says. And soon, anyway, you're going to both be dead. The Stoics are big on, you've got no time. You could be dead tomorrow. Stop worrying about someone else. Realize that anything wrong they did, you're just as likely to do yourself. Stop worrying about that. Bring power back to where you're in control. Bring compassion back to where you understand that other person is just like you. And either one of you, both of you, has got a very limited time. So make the most of it. Be responsible for all the good stuff in your life, as well as all the bad stuff in your life. And in that way, you have power and the power to change your own life. Next week, it's time for another look at the month ahead. So join me then at the usual time, Friday night. I'll see you right here.